It was 7 a.m. in Lansing, Michigan. The sun hadn't yet risen above the frost-glazed treetops, but the fluorescent lights inside the state forensic laboratory were humming with quiet intensity. The room was sterile, smelling faintly of latex gloves, old paper, and recently brewed coffee left untouched on a cluttered desk. On a central monitor, a digital profile had just completed its final render. The technician didn't move. Her breath caught for a fraction of a second as the numbers aligned. 20 full STR markers, a full match. No partial hits, no anomalies. The identity of the DNA pulled from a decades-old sliver of hair had just been linked, with complete certainty, to a living individual. She stood, silently backing away from the monitor, and called for her supervisor without taking her eyes off the screen. Within minutes, a forensic coordinator, an FBI liaison, and a representative from the cold case division were standing behind her. No one spoke. On the screen was the code name of one of the state's oldest unidentified child victims, Case 7201 Boy, known to the public, and in the hearts of several retired detectives, as simply Boy ID. The victim's file was thick, unevenly aged from the transition between typewriters and modern digital archiving. The first pages were nearly 53 years old, brittle and yellowed, with photographs paperclipped to notes in faded ink. One of the newer agents flipped through them carefully, stopping at a black-and-white image taken in January 1972. The child's face was grainy, captured in harsh winter light, eyes closed, skin bloated from exposure. The snow beneath him had melted slightly and refrozen, forming a crusted halo around his small body. There were no shoes, no tags, no name. Only a school ID in his coat pocket so worn by moisture it showed just two partial letters, D and W. No one had ever claimed the boy. No missing child report had matched. For decades he was a specter in the Michigan cold case files, a symbol of silence, failure, and what time does to justice. But now he had a name, or at least a genetic link that would lead to one. The supervisor gave the order: cross-reference the DNA with Cody's and the latest uploads from genealogical databases. Within moments, an FBI field analyst flagged a high-probability familial match, an extended cousin living in Florida. The match itself was not shocking. That's what modern forensic genealogy was designed for. What was unsettling was how close the full match would lead them. Back in the briefing room, the team gathered around a whiteboard that still bore remnants of old dry erase ink. On the top left corner, they pinned the official post-mortem reconstruction of Boy ID. Beside it, the lab technician posted a second photo, freshly printed. It was pulled from a 1972 local newspaper archive. A search party in the woods near Auburn Hills. The week after the child's body was found, 5 figures were visible. 4 were clearly labeled in the caption, police, local volunteers. The 5th, partially obscured by blowing snow, stood slightly apart from the others, back hunched, face shadowed under a wool-knit cap. There was no name in the caption, no record of his participation, just an anonymous presence at the edge of the tragedy. The young agent leaned in. The quality of the photo was low, but something about the posture of the man, the way he stood slightly turned away from the group, his right arm stiff at his side, struck him as wrong. Not mournful, not alert, almost braced. They scanned the archived search logs. No mention of a 5th civilian, no record of his volunteer status. No vehicle registered at the time that matched the man's silhouette or angle of approach. Whoever he was, he had never been interviewed, never questioned, never noticed. The agent printed the photo separately and pinned it next to the DNA report. Below it, in blue ink, he wrote 3 words, possible link unknown. No one in the room spoke for a long moment. It wasn't proof. Not yet, but this wasn't just coincidence. The man in the photo had been there, near the scene, within days of the body being found, close enough to the child's frozen remains to be immortalized in a local photographer's lens, then vanish into anonymity for over 5 decades. The agent kept staring at the man's barely visible face. A slight beard, a rounded jaw. The snow had distorted the lower half of the image. But what unsettled him wasn't the distortion. It was the fact that this was the only known image ever taken near the Boy ID crime scene, where someone had no name, no role, and no record. Outside, the wind pushed a soft howl across the building's eaves. The temperature had dropped again. January in Michigan had a way of pressing the past back into the ground, freezing over memory, hardening loss into landscape. But today, something had thawed. The supervisor finally spoke. "Let's find out who he is." The technician returned to her desk and reopened the family tree based on the genealogical match. The branches began to fill in. Florida, then Kentucky, then back up toward Detroit. One line held a name recently added to the National Criminal Database, a 78-year-old male living less than 6 miles from the original discovery site. No priors, no flag, but he had submitted DNA voluntarily as part of a medical study 2 years earlier. They cross-referenced addresses. It couldn't be a coincidence. The man in the photo, the man who lived just miles from where the child's body had been found. The man with no name now had one, but the image on the board stayed up, because what haunted the team most wasn't who he was. It was why he had never been noticed, until now. January 14th, 1972. It was a Friday evening, just after 6 p.m., when the last traces of sunlight vanished behind the pines of rural Oakland County. The wind had shifted in from the northwest, bitter and fast, carrying sharp flakes of ice that stung the face like needles. In the woods near Bald Mountain Recreation Area, 3 boys moved cautiously through the snow-dusted undergrowth, their boots crunching softly over the frozen top layer. They were carrying flashlights, .22 rifles, and the kind of naive bravery that comes from growing up in the country. They weren't supposed to be hunting after dark, but the silence of the forest made them feel like they could get away with anything. One of them, 13-year-old Travis Haller, was the first to spot the odd shape near the base of a pine. At first he thought it was an abandoned backpack or maybe a lost sleeping bag, curled in the snow. But as he approached, the flashlight in his left hand picked up a patch of human skin. He froze. The other 2 boys, already cracking jokes about rabbits, turned and followed his stare. That's when they saw it. A child, a boy, half buried in a shallow drift. His body curled tightly in on itself like he had gone to sleep against the tree and never woken up. His shoes were missing. His jacket, wool, maroon-colored with frayed cuffs, was zipped to the chin. There was a dark stain frozen around the lower hem. The snow underneath him was yellowed in patches, discolored and slick where body heat had briefly resisted the cold. His hands were clenched into fists. His face swollen, tinged blue-gray. His lips were slightly parted, a trace of dried blood trailing from one nostril. They didn't touch the body. Instead, they ran the half-mile back to the Haller farmhouse, nearly crashing through the door screaming for Travis's father. At 7:14 p.m., the Oakland County Sheriff's Office received the call. By 7:51 p.m., the scene was sealed off with 4 deputies and a state trooper. The lights from their cruisers threw long beams across the white landscape, casting shadows that seemed to bend and breathe with the trees. Photographs were taken quickly, their flash bulbs exploding silently against the snow. The body was lifted with care, but even then, a patch of skin on the lower back tore away with the ice. The boy was pronounced dead on arrival at St. Joseph Mercy Hospital. Core body temperature indicated he'd likely been exposed for at least 24 hours, possibly more. There were bruises on his chest and thighs. His right arm had a spiral fracture consistent with twisting force. His age was estimated between 9 and 11. Caucasian. Brown hair cut short and uneven, possibly at home. No cavities. Slight overbite. Weight, 61 pounds. Height, 4 feet 6 inches. In his right coat pocket, investigators found a thin plastic sleeve, once transparent, now warped from moisture. Inside, it was a crumpled school ID card with ink so faint it could barely be read. Most of the writing had bled into the paper. Only two bolded capital letters were still visible in the name field, D and W. No wallet, no other documents, no backpack, no labels on the jacket or shirt. His pants were a generic brand common in the region. His socks had holes in both heels. By the time the body was cleaned and photographed for postmortem documentation, a forensic artist had already been dispatched to begin preliminary sketches. Facial reconstruction would later be attempted using clay and dental alignment, but in the first days it was all guesswork. The boy's image, pale, bruised, anonymous, was published in the Detroit Free Press under the headline, "Do you know this child?" By January 16th, the public was calling him Boy ID. Investigators combed through every school district within a 100-mile radius. Principals were contacted. Attendance records were requested, but this was 1972. Records were paper-based, stored in office filing cabinets, sometimes handwritten, sometimes not updated for weeks. Many were lost, misfiled, or outright discarded. By the end of the first week, over 200 calls had come in. Most were false leads. A runaway here, a misidentified newspaper photo there. A few families thought they recognized him but could not provide evidence. Others refused to engage, worried about their own custody situations. An autopsy confirmed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, complicated by exposure. Time of death estimated between 48 and 72 hours before discovery. No signs of sexual assault. No defensive wounds. Toxicology came back clean. The child had died in winter silence, quickly, and without anyone nearby to record his last breath. The sheriff at the time, Harold Lockridge, held a press conference on January 18th. Standing stiffly behind the podium, he read a statement prepared by his office. "We are doing everything possible to identify this young boy and bring justice to whoever is responsible. We ask the public to come forward with any information, no matter how small." But in his eyes there was fatigue. Already the leads were drying up. Already the walls of silence were thickening. A local church held a candlelight vigil the following weekend. No name was spoken. Only a photo of the reconstructed face, set beside a plastic nameplate that read "Child of Winter." Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, a pinboard was beginning to fill with maps, threads, and Polaroids. One of the photographs taken during the initial days of the search effort showed the edge of the wooded area where the body was found. In the lower corner of the frame, partially hidden by snowfall, stood a man in a wool cap, facing slightly away from the camera. His hands were in his coat pockets, his posture stiff. The photo wasn't labeled. His face was blurred by motion. No one took note of him. Not in 1972. Not for the next 5 decades. But that image, cold, faint, forgotten, would one day surface again. And when it did, it would raise a question darker than anyone had dared ask at the time. What kind of man stands at the edge of a child's death and chooses to disappear? January 19th, 1972. The snow had not melted. Roads were still half-iced, and mailboxes along the rural stretches of Auburn Hills sat like frozen teeth along the ditches. Inside the Oakland County Sheriff's Office, investigators were piecing together what little they had: a body, a blurred photo, a faded ID card with 2 letters, and a death with no name. The pressure was immediate, but so was the noise. Calls came in non-stop, each one wrapped in confusion and good intentions. A child missing in Port Huron, a boy last seen near Flint. The names didn't match. The timelines didn't align. Most of the missing kids were either found within days or had already been crossed off. But still, every photo of Boy ID printed in the papers triggered another lead, another false hope. Investigators focused first on the possibility of a runaway. Boys did run, especially in the winter when home felt colder than the air outside. Group homes in Pontiac and East Detroit were contacted. Administrators read names off rosters with robotic exhaustion, but records were often handwritten, and in some cases, kept only in local notebooks by rotating staff. A fire at one facility the previous year had destroyed a full quarter of the case files. Others were smudged, missing, or filed under nicknames. A social worker from a youth shelter in Royal Oak thought the boy might have been a resident who had left the year before. She couldn't recall his name, but she remembered he had a scar on his hand. The coroner confirmed a small, healed wound on the right palm of the victim. For a moment, the team thought they had something. But when the shelter located their archived photos, none of them matched. The theory began to shift. Maybe this wasn't a runaway. Maybe the child had been abandoned, left by someone who didn't want to be found. It was an uncomfortable idea, and not one the sheriff's office wanted to say out loud. But off the record, they said it often. By January 21st, a more chilling possibility emerged. A witness named Evelyn Monroe, 63, living 2 miles from the forest line where the boy was found, reported seeing a dark green pickup truck idling along the road near the woods on the evening of January 12th. She remembered it because the driver left the engine running with the lights off, which made her uneasy. When asked for a plate number, she hesitated. She thought it had a B and maybe a 7 in it, but wasn't sure about the rest. That lead was pursued aggressively. Officers ran all green pickups registered in Oakland County that included AB and A7. 28 vehicles matched. They started contacting owners one by one. One of those owners was a 42-year-old man named Gerald Thatcher. Divorced, lived alone, worked nights at a print press warehouse. His truck was a match in color and model. He also had a juvenile record sealed decades earlier for inappropriate behavior toward a neighbor's child. It was enough to bring him in for questioning. Thatcher denied everything, claimed he'd been at a house party in Troy the night in question. He gave names, times, even directions to the property. At the time, officers verified the party's existence. A woman who lived at the given address confirmed he'd been there, maybe from around 6 p.m. to midnight. She wasn't entirely sure, but in 1972, that level of corroboration was enough. No digital timestamps, no surveillance footage, no GPS. Thatcher was cleared. The case narrowed, then stalled. By early February, momentum was fading. Detectives began turning inward, second-guessing each other's decisions. The media, once relentless, shifted to new tragedies. The boy's body was temporarily buried under a grave marker that read, "Unknown Child, Jan 1972. Years later, long after the case went cold, another investigator, this one fresh out of Quantico, would revisit Thatcher's alibi. The woman who vouched for him had moved to Arizona. When recontacted, she admitted something strange. There had never been a party that night. She said she just didn't want trouble. Her statement had never been sworn, it was verbal. No written transcript existed. By then, it was too late. Thatcher had died of heart failure in 1986. No one ever looked further into the green truck. In another oversight, detectives had not cataloged the clothing tag on the boy's jacket. It was homemade, no brand, no size, stitched unevenly into the lining. Only years later did a cold case analyst suggest it may have come from a local charity bin, the kind that received unsorted bulk donations from regional shelters. That thread was never followed. Psychologically, the team had begun to distance themselves. For weeks, the child had lived on their desks, their maps, their minds. But by March, his case folder was placed in a separate drawer labeled unresolved. Some of the detectives privately called the boy Snowfall, not mockingly, but as a way to cope, as if naming him something beautiful might soften the grotesque failure of not finding who he was. He became less a person than a symbol, and in that shift from boy to file, from memory to paperwork, something crucial was lost. Because buried somewhere in the witness logs, in the unfinished sketches, in the incomplete rosters and the misremembered parties was a name. One they already had. But no one, not in 1972, thought to look for it in a photograph. Time moved forward, but the case never did. By the spring of 1972, the boy's photograph had begun to yellow at the corners. Copies of the clay reconstruction sat in metal drawers, untouched since winter. The forest where he was found bloomed quietly without acknowledgement. In public, the boy ID case was fading. But behind closed doors in the homes of former officers and volunteers, he was still present, framed on walls, clipped to mirrors, pinned inside the closet doors of men who never stopped wondering who he was. One of them was Detective Walter Duran, the youngest on the original investigative team. When he retired in 1996, he took only 3 things from his desk: his badge, a silver pen, and the photo of boy ID. He placed it on the bookshelf next to his father's flag and stared at it every morning while pouring coffee. In interviews decades later, Duran would say the same line he told himself daily: "You can't bury the nameless, not properly." For those who carried the case in silence, each new anniversary was another weight. But for the rest of Michigan, the boy was simply gone. A forgotten winter, a file number, and over time, a myth. Over the next 20 years, the case saw only misdirection. In 1980, a man institutionalized in Minnesota confessed to killing a child in a forest outside Pontiac. His timeline matched. His mental state did not. When shown a photo of the actual scene, he recanted, said he made it up to get out of group therapy. In 1991, a self-proclaimed spiritual medium claimed she had seen the boy's spirit walking near a frozen river. The police didn't follow up. They didn't need to. The river in question had thawed completely by February 1972. The most promising false lead came in 1994, when a missing persons case from Illinois was reclassified. The boy in that file, Mark Ellison, disappeared in December 1971, roughly a month before boy ID discovery. The resemblance was striking. Mark was 10, thin, dark-haired, similar height. But after weeks of renewed interviews and genetic comparisons with Mark's surviving relatives, the results came back negative. No match. No closure. Just another door closed. Behind the scenes, a few amateur sleuths kept the case alive. One of them was a librarian named Sarah Brodsky, who in 2003 began uploading archival articles onto a regional history blog. Her database included scans of old newspapers, advertisements, and public notices. It wasn't official. It wasn't even particularly organized. But it contained something no police database had logged: an image from December 1971, pulled from the Pontiac Daily Chronicle showing a man carrying a young boy across the street outside a toy store. The caption read only, "Holiday Rush Downtown." The man's face was turned away. The child's face, however, was visible. He was bundled in a thick red jacket, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open as if caught mid-sentence. It was blurry, as all photos printed in newspaper columns were back then, but it was enough. In 2011, a cold case researcher stumbled across the blog while cross-referencing regional sightings of children matching boy ID description. He paused on the photo, then zoomed, then froze. The coat, same texture, same color. The chin, the hairline, even the slight overbite visible through the blur. The image wasn't conclusive, but it was impossible to ignore. The man carrying him had a distinct profile: broad shoulders, receding hairline, a wool cap pulled low. And for the second time in this investigation, a man in a wool cap was found standing near a child who would later vanish into snow. No caption named him. No witness report described the moment. The photo had been buried in a lifestyle section about last-minute Christmas shopping. By now, the original evidence files had thinned to almost nothing. Items had been misplaced during transfers. Several photos were stored improperly and degraded from moisture damage. But the images remained: the boy in the woods, and now the boy outside the toy store. A forensic analyst at the Michigan State Police Headquarters requested high-resolution scans of both photos. She ran a visual comparison against the original facial reconstruction of boy ID. Her conclusion was cautious but clear. The probability of visual consistency between the two boys exceeded 90%. Still, no one knew who the man was. He was nameless. A second silhouette, a second vanishing, and just like the photo from the search party weeks later, he wasn't in any official log. Somewhere in Michigan, someone had carried the boy twice. Once across a sidewalk under Christmas lights, and again months later through snow and branches, to leave him under a pine. The psychologist working with the cold case unit flagged the repetition. In child murder cases, perpetrators often oscillate between control and concealment. Carrying the child publicly implies possession, almost a parental mimicry. Abandoning them in silence implies shame or fear. When both behaviors occur within weeks, it often signals a deeper psychopathy, the desire to erase without ever having to explain. This wasn't just a killing, it was a staging, and the man in the cap had played both scenes. Back in Lansing, the new team began cataloging public images from the 1971 holiday season. Parade footage, charity events, city council meetings, anything printed with photographs. Slowly, they began marking faces that repeated. The man with the wool cap showed up once more, in the background of a church food drive in early January 1972. Always at the edge, always slightly blurred, never facing the lens. None of the old suspect lists had included his name. None of the background checks had mentioned him. He had no known connection to the original investigation. Because, as it turned out, no one ever asked who took the photo that day in the woods, and no one noticed the man standing just beyond the flash. In February 2024, the box arrived at the Michigan State Police Forensic Archive in a plain brown wrapper with no return address, only a barcode and a hand-signed requisition tag. Inside was a vacuum-sealed envelope labeled with a date nearly 52 years old. January 1972. Its contents: 3 strands of human hair retrieved from the collar of a wool coat found on a child's body near Bald Mountain. The coat belonged to boy ID. Previous DNA attempts in the late 1990s had failed. The degradation was too severe, the technology too primitive. But now, with next-generation sequencing and mitochondrial genome reconstruction, there was another chance. A volunteer unit working under the Forensic Genealogy Initiative, a non-profit partnership between state agencies and private labs, offered to run the sample. It was a long shot. Everyone knew it, but in cold cases, long shots are often the only shots left. By March, partial results were in. The mitochondrial DNA was intact enough to trace maternal lineage. Within weeks, the data was uploaded to a secure genealogical database. The algorithm began its work. Branches of potential relatives lit up across the map: Illinois, Kentucky, parts of Ontario, but one line stood out. A second cousin, living in northern Florida. Her name was Arlene Whitmore, 64, retired nurse. She had submitted her DNA years earlier as part of a breast cancer study. When contacted, she was startled but cooperative. She confirmed her family had deep roots in Michigan, including an uncle who passed away in the early 1970s. She mentioned a brother named Richard who had relocated back north decades ago. When asked if she had any relatives who went missing as children, she hesitated. Then she said a name: Daniel, a boy no one in the family had seen since 1972. The case file shifted instantly. Investigators focused on Richard Whitmore, now 69, a retired machinist living alone in Genesee County. He agreed to meet in person. The interview took place in a sunlit living room filled with dust motes and old furniture. On the walls were photographs, wedding portraits, graduation caps, a family trip to Mackinac Island, but no children. When shown a copy of the reconstructed face of boy ID, Richard paused. His lips parted slightly. He asked for a moment. Then he walked into a back room and returned with an old Polaroid photo, edges curled. It showed a little boy standing in the grass beside a sandbox. Red jacket, brown hair, slouching posture. His arm was bandaged. The back of the photo read, Daniel, age 4, spring 66, Richard stared at the photo, then back at the image on the agent's folder. His voice was low, nearly a whisper. I always thought he died. They told me he died of pneumonia. His parents, long deceased, had insisted Daniel had passed away suddenly while visiting relatives. Richard was 17 at the time, in and out of juvenile facilities. He was never allowed to attend a funeral. No grave was shown to him. No ashes, just silence reinforced by threat. We didn't talk about things in our family, he said, especially if they were hard. The agents asked what he remembered last. Richard closed his eyes. He recalled Daniel's 5th birthday, balloons, cake from a box. And then a neighbor had stopped by, a man named Thomas, who offered to take Daniel into town to buy a small gift. Richard couldn't remember the man's last name, but he remembered the truck. Dark green, scratched fender, always smelled of gasoline and pipe tobacco. That was the last time he saw his brother. At the time, he had believed the story his parents gave him. Daniel had gotten sick, was taken to a hospital downstate, complications, pneumonia. It was over quickly. It was better not to dwell. But now, more than 50 years later, he was looking at the same boy, same eyes, same posture, and a very different truth. The forensic team confirmed the match within 48 hours. The mitochondrial DNA from the coat aligned with Richard's autosomal profile. In probability terms, the odds were nearly absolute. The boy in the woods was Daniel Whitmore. The team filed a formal identity restoration request with the Department of Vital Records. For the first time since January 1972, the grave at the edge of the Oakland Cemetery could finally bear a name, Daniel. It should have been a moment of closure, but for the task force it only raised deeper questions. Who was the man who took him? Why did the family never investigate the circumstances of his disappearance? And how had a 5-year-old vanished into a snow-covered forest without a trace of law enforcement contact? As the team dug into old neighborhood maps, a name surfaced, Thomas Greaves, listed as a resident of the Whitmore Street from 1968 to 1973. At the time, 27 years old, no criminal record, no prior complaints. But what caught their attention was this. Greaves had participated in the 1972 search effort for boy ID. He had even spoken to a local reporter once briefly, but never provided his name on record. When they pulled the photo again, the one taken during the early search parties in January, they isolated the face of the man in the wool cap, standing just beyond the camera's focal point. They enhanced it, cleaned the grain, adjusted for light bleed, the outline of his jaw, the slope of his cheek. It matched a DMV photo of Thomas Greaves taken in 1994. The man who had once carried Daniel across a sidewalk during Christmas shopping. The man who had stood at the tree line while others looked for a body he already knew was there. He had never left Michigan, and he had never been questioned. Until now. It was 11 a.m. on a cloudy Monday in June 2025, when the unmarked sedan pulled into the gravel driveway of a modest single-story home in Orion Township. The front lawn was trimmed, the shutters were flaking green paint, and a faded U.S. Air Force flag hung limp from the porch post. Inside, Thomas Greaves was making tea. He was 78. His hands shook slightly as he poured hot water into a ceramic mug, steam rising in loose curls toward the fluorescent kitchen light. He wore a checkered flannel shirt buttoned too high and soft slippers that barely made a sound on the linoleum floor. His home smelled faintly of lemon furniture polish, overcooked meat, and old books. The knock came once. Calm, official. When he opened the door, the two agents introduced themselves without urgency. Greaves blinked once, nodded, and stepped aside. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't offer to sit. Inside, One of the agents removed a manila folder from her bag and placed it on the table. It contained 5 photographs. The first was the black and white image from the 1972 search party, Greaves in a wool cap, standing just at the edge of the tree line. The second was the toy store photo from December 1971, Greaves holding a child in a red jacket, face turned slightly toward the camera. The third was Daniel Whitmore's reconstructed image. The fourth, Daniel's death photo. The fifth was a DMV portrait of Greaves from 1994 laid beside a high-resolution enhancement of the wool cap figure. When the folder closed, Greaves didn't look away. The agent asked him a single question. "Do you know who this boy is?" Greaves exhaled through his nose. It was long, slow, and utterly without surprise. Then he said, "I didn't mean to hurt him." He said it without emotion, no crack in his voice, no panic, just fatigue. What followed over the next 2 hours was a confession, not detailed, not tearful, but complete. Greaves had been a quiet man in the neighborhood in the early 70s, a man people trusted. He fixed cars, walked dogs, brought over casseroles when families were sick. He had no children, no wife, and he had taken an interest in Daniel from the moment the boy turned 4. On January 10, 1972, Daniel's 6th birthday, Greaves offered to take him into town to pick out a toy. Daniel's parents agreed without hesitation. He'd done it for neighbor kids before, always returned them. But this time something changed. Greaves said Daniel had started asking questions about why they never went inside the store, about why the truck had driven past the shopping center. Greaves told investigators he didn't have a plan, that he panicked, that when Daniel tried to open the truck door, he grabbed his arm, twisted hard, and the boy started screaming. He pulled over, got out, dragged Daniel by the arm into the woods off a service road near Bald Mountain. It was cold. The snow had begun to fall again. He struck the boy once with an open palm, then again with a closed fist. After that, he wasn't sure. He remembered Daniel on the ground, remembered walking back to the truck alone. The next morning, he returned and moved the body deeper into the woods, covering it with snow. 3 days later, he volunteered for the search party. He stood quietly at the perimeter, watching them comb the area he already knew. He was even photographed, but no one remembered his name. When asked why he killed the boy, he didn't offer psychology or excuses. Only this: "Because I didn't want anyone to know who I really was." It might have ended there, an old man's quiet confession sealed with silence. But a background clearance ordered later that week revealed something else, something that never appeared in any public record. A sealed file from 1970 showed that Thomas Greaves had once been detained on suspicion of indecent exposure involving 2 minors in Monroe County. Charges had been dropped due to insufficient evidence, but deeper in the file, buried in a sealed memorandum marked internal use only, was a note. Subject agreed to serve as community-level informant in exchange for non-prosecution, access to selected youth programs, monitor anti-government activity. It was signed by a local intelligence liaison assigned to the sheriff's office. Greaves was a registered source, which meant that when the 1972 investigation began and names were reviewed for proximity to the Whitmore home, his had been flagged, but also quietly removed. A form of immunity. Whether intentional or the result of bureaucratic layering, the outcome was the same. The man who had carried Daniel Whitmore to his death had been known to the system all along, not as a suspect, but as a tool. The case files from 1972 were reviewed. Greaves had never been formally interviewed, never fingerprinted, never even noted as part of the volunteer list. He had floated just outside every circle, present but invisible. And now, in 2025, the truth had surfaced, but not through justice, through endurance. Because somewhere in the timeline the system stopped looking, and he never stopped watching. It was just past 3 p.m. when Thomas Greaves was escorted into interview room 4 at the Michigan State Police facility. The room was gray, sterile, softly humming with recycled air and overhead lights. A steel table sat in the middle, scuffed at the edges. A single camera was mounted high in the corner, silently recording. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask for water. He sat slowly, adjusted the sleeves of his cardigan, and folded his hands in front of him. The room smelled faintly of dust, vinyl, and something older, like paper left too long in sun. The lead investigator placed a small recorder on the table and pressed record. Greaves nodded once. "I'll tell you," he said, "but I want to do it my way." Over the next 49 minutes, Greaves gave what would later be called a cold narrative. His voice never rose, never cracked. He walked the investigators through the afternoon of January 10th, 1972, as if he were reading from a list. He had seen Daniel outside his house that morning, playing alone in the snow near the edge of the street. The boy had gloves that didn't match and a knit hat pulled down too far. Greaves had told him he was going to town to get something special, and asked if he wanted to come along. Daniel said yes. He always said yes. In the truck, Greaves said he offered the boy a piece of candy, something he always kept in the glove box. Daniel hesitated but took it. Greaves said they drove for a while, past the toy store, past the diner, past where the streets stopped having sidewalks. The child grew quiet. Then he asked, "Aren't we going the wrong way?" Greaves said he didn't answer. About 10 minutes later, he pulled off onto a service road near the northern edge of Bald Mountain. He parked behind a thicket of trees. Daniel asked again where they were going. "I didn't answer," Greaves repeated. He said the boy tried to open the door. That's when he reached across, grabbed his wrist, twisted it, and pulled him across the seat. Daniel kicked him in the leg. Greaves said he panicked. He shoved him back, hit him once. "Not hard," he added. "Not the first time. But the second time he used his closed fist." He said Daniel fell sideways into the snow, dazed, bleeding from the nose. He didn't move for several seconds. Greaves dragged him by the coat deeper into the woods, still unsure what to do. "I didn't plan to kill him," he said. "I just didn't know how to make him stop." By the time he realized Daniel had stopped breathing, his own hands were shaking so badly he couldn't open the truck door again. He left the body, drove home, washed his clothes twice, burned the gloves in his backyard barrel. The next morning, when the boy had not returned and neighbors began asking questions, he offered to help with the search. He told them he had seen Daniel the day before, playing with sticks. He even brought coffee to the volunteers. When the photo was taken, him standing at the edge of the woods, he remembered staring at the spot where the body still lay, hidden under the snow. "I thought maybe someone would find him," he said. "But when they didn't, I didn't say anything." 2 days later, a group of teenagers discovered the body. Greaves didn't go near the scene. He stayed back, let the investigation pass him by. When asked why he never came forward, even as decades passed, Greaves looked at the table. "I figured if God wanted me caught, he'd have done it by now." The confession was chilling not in what it revealed, but in what it lacked. There was no sorrow, no rage, no self-pity, only detachment. Greaves spoke as though he'd watched someone else do it, a man he no longer recognized, or perhaps never stopped being. Later, during the psychological evaluation, a forensic psychiatrist described Greaves as exhibiting traits consistent with compartmentalized predatory behavior. He was methodical, patient. He targeted vulnerability cloaked in familiarity. He did not act in fury, he acted in silence. More chillingly, he described the aftermath of the crime as an exercise in blending back in. Greaves didn't isolate, he didn't flee. He volunteered, maintained routines, attended neighborhood barbecues. For 5 decades, he became invisible by appearing exactly as expected. When asked what he feared most, he did not say prison or guilt. He said this: "Being alone, I hate the sound of an empty house." In his home, police found dozens of photos tucked into shoeboxes, images of birthday parties, block events, church picnics. Almost all featured children. None of them were labeled. But there was no evidence of additional crimes, no physical trophies, nothing overt, just presence. He had lived near schools, near playgrounds, near families that trusted him, and no one ever suspected. It wasn't that Thomas Greaves had escaped justice. It was that justice never looked where he stood, until someone finally asked the question the original detectives had missed. Not who is this boy, but rather who was near him and not in the file. It was a cool October morning when the new headstone arrived. Granite, dark gray, polished to a near mirror. The engraving was simple, just a name, a date, and a line beneath. Daniel Whitmore, January 10, 1966 to January 10, 1972. He was never forgotten. Now he is known. The small cemetery near Lake Orion had not seen a crowd in years. But that day, nearly 100 people stood in the grass, boots pressing into damp earth. Some were neighbors, some were family, most were strangers. They had read about the case, heard it unfold through the news cycle. A boy with no name, a killer hiding in plain sight, a 53-year delay. Now the boy had his name back. The service was brief. No hymns, no speeches. Just wind passing through the trees, and a handful of words from Richard Whitmore, now 70, who had spent most of his life believing his little brother had died of illness. He stood by the headstone, gripping a small photograph in one hand. It showed him as a teenager, seated beside Daniel in the yard, a dog between them, both laughing at something just out of frame. "I don't remember the joke," he said, "but I remember the sound." The community planted a maple sapling near the grave. It would take years to grow, but for the first time in over 5 decades, the earth above Daniel was no longer marked by absence. News coverage reached national outlets. Boy ID had become a symbol, not just of failure but of repair, too late for justice but not for truth. And yet, beneath the closure, something darker remained. The Michigan Department of Justice launched an internal audit into cold case handling, focusing on the 1972 omission of Thomas Greaves from suspect review. The leaked memo, revealing Greaves' status as a law enforcement informant, sparked outrage across the state. A name once buried in the periphery of official records had been actively shielded, not by mistake but by design. In committee hearings, retired officers were questioned. No one remembered authorizing the exclusion. No one recalled his role in the search effort. But the file was there. The protection was real. Within a year, new legislation passed requiring full retention of all known participant identities in child death investigations. No volunteer, informant, or civilian was to be excluded from suspect logs under any pretext. The law was unofficially named Daniel's Rule. But legal reform was only one part of the reckoning. Greaves died 3 months after his arrest, awaiting trial. Natural causes, no appeals, no public statement. He was buried in a municipal plot, no ceremony, no obituary. His house was seized and cleared, his possessions boxed and cataloged. Among them, a single wooden toy train found at the back of a closet, still wrapped in yellowed newspaper dated January 1972. Its price tag was unreadable. Back in Oakland County, the forensic team printed one final photo. It was the same image that opened the case file in 1972, a wide shot of the search party. Snow falling lightly, trees bare, but this time they zoomed in. Near the edge of the frame, the man in the wool cap stood with his back partially turned, face caught just enough in profile to be recognizable. A sticker was affixed to the photo's bottom right corner. Identified, Thomas Greaves. Perimeter, search day 2, The image now hangs in the state training facility for cold case investigators, a reminder that the face of a killer is not always hidden. Sometimes it is simply ignored, and sometimes justice arrives too late to speak, but just in time to be seen.